In the damp, bone-chilling winter of 1664, a heavy black carriage rattled through the shadowed, narrow streets of London, carrying a secret cargo that could have rewritten the laws of nature or utterly destroyed a man's reputation. Inside sat Thomas Hobbes, the most feared and brilliant intellect in Europe. He was 76 years old, a man famous for his cold, unyielding materialism, a philosopher who argued that the universe was nothing but clockwork, particles, and matter in motion. Yet, buried deep in his heavy woolen pocket, he nervously clutched a small, heavy packet of transmuting powder, whispered to have been given by a mysterious foreign stranger who promised it could turn base lead into pure, glittering gold. The man who famously wrote that human life was naturally nasty, brutish, and short was about to find out, in the most humiliating fashion imaginable, exactly how short a con man's memory could be when faced with a pocketful of stolen coin. It is a delicious historical irony. The great prophet of security, the architect of absolute social order, got cleaned out by a parlor trick. To understand why the great Thomas Hobbes was risking his remaining dignity in the dark, damp shadows of Restoration London, we have to understand the specific, nagging itch that kept him awake during the long nights of his old age. Hobbes had survived the catastrophic upheaval of the English Civil War, a decade of bitter exile in Paris, and the relentless, spitting wrath of the English Church, which viewed his philosophy as little more than atheistic heresy. He had given the world Leviathan in 1651, the monumental book that argued we desperately need an absolute, unyielding sovereign to save us from our own worst, most violent impulses. He was an international celebrity, but in 17th-century England, celebrity did not pay the baker, buy firewood, or settle tavern tabs. Hobbes lived primarily on a modest, fixed pension granted by his former pupil and lifelong patron, the Duke of Devonshire. He was comfortable, yes, but he was certainly not rich. And in an age of sudden political reversals, where kings returned from exile, parliaments flipped, and plague swept through the cobblestone alleys, a pension could vanish with a single stroke of a royal pen or the death of a benefactor. Hobbes knew the hard economic value of security better than anyone alive. He also knew, with a quiet, mounting desperation, that nothing secured a man's independence quite like gold. It was the ultimate, undeniable shield against a volatile world. Enter a man known to the historical record simply as the Frenchman or the adept. He arrived in London with no discernible pedigree, no letters of introduction, but with an abundance of aristocratic poise and terrifyingly persuasive charm, carrying whispers of the legendary projection powder, the mythical catalyst of the philosopher's stone. To our modern, technologically jaded ear, alchemy sounds like absolute fairy tale magic, the realm of hocus-pocus and medieval wizards. But in 1664, it was the absolute cutting edge of experimental science. Robert Boyle, the founding father of modern chemistry, was actively trying to multiply precious metals in his laboratory. Isaac Newton was secretly filling thousands of pages of notebooks with alchemical formulas and esoteric recipes. If the universe was just a giant machine composed of interacting particles, as Hobbes firmly believed, then why couldn't one manipulate its internal gears to change one element into another? It wasn't magic to them, it was chemistry before the rules had been officially codified. When the stranger approached Hobbes and offered a private, eyes-only demonstration, the old philosopher couldn't resist the temptation. He pridefully believed his own ironclad intellect was far too sharp to ever be fooled by a charlatan. The demonstration itself was a masterclass in theatrical misdirection. In a private rented room, far from prying eyes, before Hobbes and a select few eager gentlemen of the burgeoning Royal Society, the stranger placed a crucible of ordinary, dull lead over an open flame. With great solemnity and theatrical flair, he added a tiny pinch of his glowing red projection powder. The mixture immediately bubbled, hissed violently, and released a thick, sweet-smelling plume of smoke that filled the small chamber. When the crucible finally cooled, the grey, worthless lead had vanished. In its place lay a bright, yellow, highly malleable nugget of metal. Hobbes, who prided himself above all things on rigorous empirical observation and sensory proof, examined it closely. He tested its weight in his palm, its softness under an iron file, its stubborn resistance to corrosive acids. It was, by every scientific test available to the 17th-century mind, pure, unadulterated gold. What Hobbes did not see, or perhaps desperately chose not to see, blinded by his own desire for financial independence, was the clever double-bottomed crucible, or the hollow iron-stirring rod, pre-filled with gold dust, that quietly melted away into the mix during the heating process. The trap had been expertly sprung. The stranger did not immediately ask for a direct, crude sale of the powder that would have raised the old philosopher's suspicions. Instead, with a mournful sigh, he lamented the staggering cost of his rare ingredients. To create a larger batch of the powder, enough to produce gold by the pound rather than the ounce, he desperately needed an infusion of venture capital. He needed £500 in hard cash, a truly astronomical sum at the time, roughly equivalent to several years of a comfortable nobleman's income. Hobbes, utterly convinced he was standing on the absolute cusp of total financial freedom and independence, did something entirely uncharacteristic for a man usually defined by cold prudence. He did not consult his patron, the Duke of Devonshire. He did not seek the advice of his intellectual circle. Instead, he quietly gathered his life savings, liquidated a significant portion of his modest assets, and handed the heavy canvas sack of gold coins directly to the stranger in exchange for a sealed leather pouch of the red powder, along with a complex activation formula that demanded 3 weeks of continuous, precise furnace heating. 3 excruciating weeks passed in total silence. Hobbes followed the elaborate instructions to the letter, nursing a small, smoky furnace in the corner of his London lodgings day and night, watching the red powder bake under steady heat. But the lead stubbornly remained laid. The powder did nothing except turn a soot-choked black and emit a foul, sulphurous stench that ruined his draperies. When Hobbes finally marched down to the stranger's lodgings to demand an immediate explanation, the bird had long since flown. The bewildered landlord informed him that the foreign gentleman had departed swiftly for the Channel ports toward France a fortnight prior, leaving behind nothing but an empty, draughty trunk and a towering pile of unpaid local tavern bills. The great philosopher of realism, the man who spent a lifetime warning humanity against the deceptive illusions of the human mind, had been utterly, comprehensively cleaned out. He had bought the ultimate dream of easy, risk-free security, and in doing so, ironically proved his own darkest philosophical theory, that in the natural state of chaos, men are relentlessly driven by an insatiable desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death. So where did the money actually go? The elusive Frenchman was never apprehended by the authorities. Police records from Paris later suggested a smooth-talking con artist matching his exact description arrived in the French capital weeks later, living in lavish luxury under a completely assumed title before vanishing permanently into the shadows of Italy. Hobbes never publicly admitted to the staggering loss. To do so would have invited the merciless mockery of his many enemies and ecclesiastical critics, who already accused him of every moral failing under the sun. Instead, he quietly returned to his writing desk, living out his remaining years on the steady charity of the Cavendish family. He died at 91, his razor-sharp intellect completely intact, but his personal pockets considerably lighter. He had sought a shortcut to absolute sovereignty over his own life, only to discover that the stubborn laws of physical reality care nothing for the desperate desires of mortal men. His masterwork, Leviathan *, remains an immortal pillar of political philosophy, not because he knew the secret formula to manufacture gold, but because he understood, down to his bones, the desperate, irrational lengths to which human fear and greed will ultimately drive us all.